Hi, this is Alex, and if you love music, well, you're in the right place because we're all about albums. Today's video deals with the 10 albums I cannot live without. These are the 10 albums that if I had to give up all my records but 10, these would be the 10 I would take with me. This is somewhat unrealistic. However, it's a good emotional and mental exercise in that it will teach you a lot about the music you really love and that you listen to most often. Before we start, however, there are a few ground rules. Well, what are the rules? First of all, as I said, it is for albums, so greatest hits do not count. Greatest hits are presentations of music throughout the career of the artist, and I want this as a single presentation. But is a live album a single presentation? Absolutely. So live albums are okay. Next, we can only have one album per artist. Now, this is really difficult for me because if I take my maybe 2 or 3 favorite bands, I can probably fill 5 or 6 slots of my top 10. But you're not allowed to do that. You have 10 albums you choose. You have to have 10 different artists. You know, rules are rules. So let's get going. The first album I choose is from the Beatles, my favorite band. Now, the Beatles have a large discography and a lot of fantastic records. Again, I can fill many of my top 10 albums with Beatle records. What are the candidates? Well, the first Beatle album, the Please Please Me album, and I love that record because it had raw energy. You first met the Beatles and they were a fun, exciting band. And there are a lot of great moments in that record. So that's one I was considering. The second one I'm considering is an album that's a little bit overlooked by people. It's Hard Day's Night. Yes, it was a motion picture. But again, this album, if you really listen to it carefully, has some of the most beautiful love songs the Beatles ever wrote and some amazing harmonies. So I really adore this record. The other record to consider was one that I always called my favorite Beatles record, and that is Rubber Soul. Rubber Soul showed the transition from the early love songs of the Beatles to a more mature sound with more complex and meaningful songs that were being done. However, there are other albums to consider as well. One is Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, came out in 1967. Many people consider it the greatest album of the 1960s, and again, a landmark record. This changed music from here on out. Why? Not only were the songs remarkable, but there were many amazing things that were done by the recording engineers for this album at the request of the Beatles and George Martin that were never done before. They actually had to come up with most of these things on the fly. However, I didn't pick this either. The album I did pick is the album I think is the greatest album by the Beatles, the album that showed the great maturity and musicianship and genius of the Beatles, and that is Abbey Road. It turns out, when I thought about it, Abbey Road's on my turntable more than any other Beatles record, and therefore, really, Rubber Soul isn't my most go-to album. It's actually Abbey Road. Abbey Road came out in 1969, and it was the last studio album by the Beatles. Now you're thinking, well, wasn't Let It Be out after Abbey Road? And you're right. There was a problem. Actually, Let It Be was the second to last studio album, but because of some technical and other issues, Let It Be came out after Abbey Road. Abbey Road was released late in 1969 and ended the year as a #1 overall record. Now, the second side of Abbey Road, to me, is probably the most perfect album side ever recorded. So that's my pick for the first record, is Abbey Road. Moving on to my second pick. In high school, I would always say that my favorite band is the Stones, even though that's not true. I just told you the Beatles were my favorite band, but in high school and college, it wasn't cool to say your favorite band was the Beatles, so I said it was the Stones. And the Rolling Stones are one of my favorite bands of all time. They also have a fairly extensive discography, and they had a longer career than the Beatles, and are still producing records to this day. The early catalog of the Stones comprised of many hit singles. Many of them are iconic and I love. Most of the other songs were rhythm and blues songs, some of which they wrote and some of which they covered. Therefore, I didn't think that these were appropriate records to pick. Again, I'm looking for playability. Which one record would I take? The first great Stones album is probably Beggar's Banquet. This showed finally some maturity, and this is one of the records that you would listen to and say, yeah, this could be the greatest rock and roll band in the world, and this is the label that people gave the Rolling Stones. The next album to consider is Let It Bleed. Now, Let It Bleed, by many accounts, many fans would say that's the greatest Rolling Stones record, and I won't argue. There's some great songs. It's Give Me Shelter and You Can't Always Get What You Want. A great rocker in Monkey Man, a song that is not played that often on the radio, and Midnight Rambler, and other great songs. However, I didn't pick this one either. There is the double record, Exile on Main Street, which most critics would say is the Stones' greatest album. They recorded this in France, downstairs in a mansion, and got this really amazing sound. But again, for playability, I did not pick this album. Why? Well, I picked Sticky Fingers. Now, Sticky Fingers came out in 1971. This album contained probably the most varied of all the Rolling Stone records. It contains both the blues, it has rockers, country type tunes, as well as jazz influence song of Can't You Hear Me Knockin'. Interesting fact, in Keith Richards' biography, he credits Brown Sugar as entirely written and composed by Mick Jagger. Keith Richards and Mick Jagger, usually Richards wrote the music and Jagger wrote the lyrics, but in this instance, Brown Sugar was totally done by Mick Jagger, which I thought was kind of interesting. Sticky Fingers ends with one of my favorite Stones song, which is Moonlight Mile. And because of all those things I discussed, Sticky Fingers is my choice for my second album. During my teen years, The Who really spoke to me. They were all about raw power, angry, angst, and I thought that that was perfect for a young teenage male. The first great record by The Who is Tommy, which is a rock opera which was made both into a movie and a Broadway show. This album showed Pete Townshend's musical genius. Tommy is a very thought-provoking record, with obviously the iconic song Pinball Wizard featured on the album. The other rock opera that The Who recorded was Quadrophenia. Actually, I enjoy Quadrophenia more. Why? Well, during my teenage year, this is probably the most angry album The Who made, and I really connected with this album. And by the way, in the movie of Quadrophenia, Sting appears as one of the lead mods, which was one of the two gangs portrayed in the movie of the mods and the rockers in Quadrophenia. However, I did not pick either of these two records. The choice was very easy to me. I picked what I consider the greatest rock album of all time. I will repeat that, the greatest rock album of all time, Who's Next? Who's Next came out in 1971, has the iconic album cover. This album contained many smash hits by The Who, and it showed the raw power, the great guitar work of Pete Townshend, probably Roger Daltrey's greatest vocals on any album, and the great drumming, as usual, by Keith Moon, and the great bass by John Entwistle. Every song on this album is a classic, from the opener of Baba O'Reilly into Bargain and Goin' Mobile, and then the final song, the classic Behind Blue Eyes. I believe this album should be in any top 10 classic rock collection. Well, we've talked a lot about male bands, and what about the women? Well, the next artist is a female, which is Joni Mitchell. Joni Mitchell is an extremely talented artist. Her vocals are tremendous. Her songs are fabulous and well written, and she is very musically diverse and probably had a long career due to the fact that she changed with the times. She went from folk to pop and then more into the jazz influences in her later albums. Joni Mitchell can be broken down into her early albums, such as Clouds, which is a great folk album. I would also consider Ladies of the Canyon next. It was one of the most beautiful records she ever recorded. The next record is what some people consider her greatest achievement, which is the album Blue. Blue is an introspective record about her relationship and the fragility of relationships, and it was a very revealing album, and it's an audiophile favorite. And I love this record, but I didn't pick this record. I went with maybe one of her more commercially successful albums, which is Court and Spark. I picked Court and Spark because I think it's the most playable album. This album contains some great folk songs. It also contains some pop songs, which was new for Joni Mitchell. And you can see some early jazz influences on this album as well. It is extremely well recorded, and this album I can play time and time again. This album is on my turntable at least once every other month, and I've owned this album since it came out. So I've played this album hundreds of times. Do I think this is her greatest record? No, I do not, but I think it's her most playable record and the one I most enjoy, so that's my fourth pick for the 10 albums I can't live without. Not all my selections are from the 60s and 70s. One of my all-time favorite artists is Aimee Mann. Now, Aimee Mann went to Berklee College of Music. She was in a band called the Young Snakes. After that, she formed in 1983 the band Till Tuesday, which in 1985 recorded their first album, which is Voices Carry. That title song became a hit record for them, and I think it was the second song that Aimee Mann actually recorded. Till Tuesday went on to be nominated as the Best New Band from 1985. And that single, Voices Carry, reached the number 8 spot on the Billboard charts. After the band's third album, the band broke up in 1990, and Aimee Mann then went on to have a solo career. Aimee's first 2 albums garnered a lot of praise. However, they were not successful albums. It wasn't until 1999 where she wrote several songs for the soundtrack of Magnolia that people took notice. She went on to be nominated for both a Grammy Award and for an Academy Award for her song Save Me, appearing in the soundtrack of Magnolia. Aimee was frustrated with the recording label, and she got out of her contract with Geffen Records and then started her own record label called Super Ego Records. All of Aimee Mann's solo albums are good to great. I think her 3 albums to consider, at least for me, would be the 1995 album I'm With Stupid, followed by the 1999 album Bachelor No. 2, and then her follow-up record, the 2002 release of Lost in Space. All of these albums are, to me, almost masterpieces. I'm With Stupid is the transition record where she showed she can do more than pop music. She wrote some beautiful ballads, and lyrically she matured quite a bit. Her next album, Bachelor No. 2, dealt with some relationships, and I think that this was, to me, the most replayable album she has. I can listen to this album endlessly. The next album is Lost in Space. A lot of my friends and critics think this is her greatest album. Indeed, this is a great record. I play it quite often. 2 of my favorite songs by Aimee Mann appear on this album. However, as I said, due to repeat playability and being a romantic at heart and like songs about relationships, I picked Bachelor No. 2, and that is my 5th pick. My next pick moves musical genres into the alternative folk Americana genre, one of my favorite genres. There are many great Americana albums to choose from. These artists would include Gillian Welch, Rosanne Cash, Courtney Marie Andrews, The Secret Sisters, the Milk Carton Kids, and many others. However, I did not choose any of these more popular groups. I picked the band called Over the Rhine. Now, Over the Rhine is basically a husband and wife team of Linford Detweiler, and Callan Berquist. They met in Cincinnati in the neighborhood of Over the Rhine, and that's where they got the name. In 1989, they formed the band, and they've been on the road and have recorded, I think, 17 studio albums and multiple live albums as well. They are still making records today. The first time I heard Over the Rhine was on satellite radio in the early 2000s, and I heard songs from the album called Drunkard's Prayer. And this is actually the album that I'm picking. This album is about relationships. They had been on the road together for many years, and they were finding it to be straining on their marriage. Both Linford and Karen sat down and spoke about their past career, where they're at now, and the pressures that it has caused to their marriage. They discussed, can they move on and still record albums and tour and still have the relationship that they want to have with their marriage. They decided that they could do this, and they have done this very successfully. I have seen them live in concert several times, and I would say that Karen is, if not the best, one of the 2 or 3 best female singers I've ever seen on stage. Now, Drunkard's Prayer, if you get the vinyl, it's a bonus because there are 3 extra songs, which are all live songs. Also, the end of the album, they recorded one of the most classic American tunes by Rodgers and Hart, which is My Funny Valentine. This song has been recorded umpteen times, even by the great Frank Sinatra. And I could tell you, once you listen to this song, their version of My Funny Valentine, you'll fall in love with it. This is my favorite version of My Funny Valentine, and for that alone you should listen to this record. But the whole album from start to finish, it is magnificent, and I choose this as my 6th pick. Daryl Hall and John Oates had an amazing career. They started out with their first few albums not being successful. They were a Philadelphia band, and they had some local regional following, but eventually in the 1980s, with many big hits. They had 6 #1 hits, and they had 34 songs that charted in the Billboard Hot 100 during their career. And they had famous albums such as Voices, Private Eyes, and H2O. They, according to Billboard, became the most successful singing duo of all time, surpassing both the Everly Brothers and Simon and Garfunkel. My choice from the Hall & Oates album discography was quite easy for me. It is their second released album called Abandoned Luncheonette. Abandoned Luncheonette came out in 1973. It reached number 33 in the Billboard charts. It took 29 years, but it finally became platinum after 29 years, which I think is rather awesome. This album really spoke to me. I was a young teen when this album came out. This album has beautiful songs, great harmonies. All the songs are very, very memorable. And they had their big hit, She's Gone, on this album. This was an easy pick in my top 10. Why is that? Well, believe it or not, Abandoned Luncheonette is my favorite album of all time. It was my favorite album of all time when I first listened to it, and all these years later, I still think it is my #1 album. The next artist I want to talk about is a woman who had a very short career. She actually had only one official album release, which is called Live at Blues Alley. Tragically, only 10 months after this recording, Eva passed away from cancer. At the 20th anniversary of the recording, a second album release called Nightbird was released. This album contained all 31 songs performed on the evening of January 3rd. Prior, only 12 songs were included in the original album release. Eva was really an undiscovered great talent in 1996. Once she opened her voice and sang, everyone knew she was a star. Why record labels passed on her is, I don't know, hard to understand, but they did. She was a little disheartened, but in 1996, using her own money, she recorded this great live album. This is one of the best recorded live albums I own. This album is wonderful. The singing is sensational. Interesting, Eva had a cold that night, and when she heard the recording back in the studio, she didn't want to release the record. But they included one studio song of hers that was really beautifully recorded, and because of that one song, she agreed to release the album. And thank God she did, or we may never have heard of Eva Cassidy. So for my 8th pick, Live at Blues Alley by Eva Cassidy is my choice. My next pick is an album by Pink Floyd. Now, Pink Floyd had many great albums that were recorded during their career, including Wish You Were Here in 1975 and their famous The Wall album of 1979, a rock opera much like Tommy and Quadrophenia of the Who. This rock opera dealt with isolationism from society, and thus the title of the album. However, the band's 8th album, Dark Side of the Moon, is my favorite album by Pink Floyd. Now, Dark Side of the Moon was released on March 1st of 1973 on the Harvest label. It has come out several times with new mastering of the album. The album deals with problems the band was going through, with the pressure they were feeling from all their success, as well as dealing with the topic of mental illness. This album is a true masterpiece. This album is iconic not only for its album cover, but it's a landmark record, one of the most important records ever released. This album has gone 14 times platinum during its lifespan. This album has been on the charts for 18 consecutive years in total, which is incredible. The album's greatness not only is due to the musicianship and the genius of Roger Waters, but also due to their great recording engineer, Alan Parsons, who used multi-tracking, tape loops, and synthesizers to come up with this fantastic sound. This album influenced many of the albums to come after it. This album is ranked in the top 10 of almost every music poll you'll see for greatest albums of all time, and this is easily in my top 10. This is actually one of the albums I would consider a top 10 album of all time. So an easy pick for number 9, Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon. This is a great record to listen to. It's an album you must listen to from start to finish, and as I said before, vinyl is conducive to listening to music from start to finish. And so I recommend listening to this album on vinyl. Well, I'm down to my last pick, and this is the hardest one. I could have picked many, many fantastic, great records in my collection. I could have picked Miles Davis, Kind of Blue, one of the greatest jazz records of all time. I could have picked Thelonious Monk's Quartet, Monk's Dream. I could have picked Mingus's album as well as other classic rock albums. I could have picked my favorite Fleetwood Mac album, which is actually not a Fleetwood Mac album at all. It's the Buckingham and Nicks album. However, my final choice came down to 2 albums. The 2 albums that it came down to was first Van Morrison's Moondance. This is a fantastic record from the 1970s. The first record, which I did not pick, is Van Morrison's Moondance. I know it's a favorite of many fans out there of Van Morrison. It's a great record from start to finish. Some of his most memorable songs is on this album. Although many fans would disagree with me, my choice for my final album is Kenny Loggins with Jim Messina, Sittin'. This album was released on Columbia Records in November of 1971. This album started out as a solo project for Kenny Loggins. However, Jim Messina, as being the producer of the album for Columbia Records, he sang a lot of background vocals, and also he played guitar. He eventually joined with Kenny Loggins, and thus the title. Why I picked this album is because this album has been on my turntable many, many times. I play it to this day. The best way to summarize this album is Beauty with Joy. If you listen to this album, you're likely to fall in love with it. Even the harshest critics will find at least a few songs on this album which they'll truly love. Well, that wraps up my top 10 pick for the albums I cannot live without. If you haven't heard any of these albums, I would really recommend you listening to it. Hey, you know, one of them may turn out to be your next favorite album. I would love to find out what are your top 10 albums on the comments below. I want to review the unknown album covers from last week. The first one I showed was actually a gimme. I actually showed it in last video. And this is the album cover. It is Deja Vu by Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young. This album came out in 1970. It's a great early country folk rock album. It contains some of the most iconic songs from these four musicians, and I highly recommend this record. It's a must for any rock collection. The next album was a little bit more difficult. I did not show it during the last video. However, the hint was 1970, and again, it's a 1970s album, and I showed the rose. Now, the rose is one of the symbols of the Grateful Dead, and this is the 1970 Grateful Dead album, American Beauty. For those of you who do not know the Grateful Dead, this is a great album to start with. It has many of its most famous tunes. It's a very accessible, and I highly recommend this album as well. I'd like to give a shout out to Doxy, who got the unknown album from last video correct. This video, the unknown albums, we're going to do a little facial recognition. So for our first unknown album cover, here it is. Okay, hope you got that one. Here's the second one. Okay, as always, if you know the answers, put them in the comments section, and I'll take a look and let you know how you did. If you enjoyed this video and you don't want to miss the next one, please subscribe by clicking on the button below. As always, this is Alex with All About Albums. Have a great day, and remember, keep them spinning.